When you think of a famous British warship of the World War period, you probably think of HMS Warspite. The grand old lady is, of course, one of Britain's finest warships. She served long and hard through some pretty severe damage, leading to Warspite often being spoken of in the same breath as USS Enterprise. Or, if you're a citizen of the Commonwealth, you can probably flip it to Enterprise being mentioned in the same breath as Warspite. However, another British warship received almost as many battle honors. That ship was a humble light cruiser, HMS Orion. She managed to rack up 13 battle honors in her 6 years of combat service, something matched only by another ship I've covered, HMS Jervis, and a ship I haven't covered, HMS Nubian. Only Warspite exceeded that record due to serving in both world wars. True enough, Orion's battles don't have the same oomph as Warspite's greatest feats, but it remains the case that Orion had her own feats. For a ship that is often overlooked, she certainly got around. With that in mind, let's kick things off with where Orion began. In this case, in the Devonport dockyard on September 26th of 1931. A dockyard that would actually build her pretty quickly, as it would turn out. Orion was launched on November 24th, 1932, just a little over a year later, and she would be commissioned on January 18th, 1934, which wasn't that much longer of a fitting out period. For peacetime, that is a perfectly respectable speed. But of course, a building period is one thing. We also have to look at what the Royal Navy got for its money. And that was, for all intents and purposes, a bog-standard Leander-class cruiser. She displaced 7,286 tons at her light loading, with the deep load going up to 9,462 tons. This allowed Orion to carry the usual Leander-class loadout, 8 6-inch 152mm guns in 4 twin turrets, in a super firing pair on the bow and another pair on the stern. These were backed up by a further 4 4-inch 102mm guns in single mounts around the superstructure, with these replaced later on by 4 twin-mounted 4-inch guns, for 8 barrels in all. Meanwhile, the dedicated anti-aircraft battery was rather lighter. Initially just 3 quad-mounted 50 caliber machine guns for 12 barrels. This would be increased over the course of the war with both 20mm cannon and 40mm guns, although the exact number here did vary, with weaponry rounded off at this point by 8 torpedo tubes in 2 quadruple mountings, one on either broadside. Which brings us to the armor protection. This was relatively average for a contemporary light cruiser. A 4-inch thick main belt with deck armor ranging from 1 1/4 to 2 inches thick. Certainly nothing to complain about, especially compared to the counties and their armored box layout. That said, all that's left to cover is the speed, which came out to 32.5 knots on 72,000 shaft horsepower, through 4 shafts in this case. Which brings us to the end of the design details and back to the service history. Service that would, initially, be in line with most of the other interwar British cruisers. These ships typically spent a little time at home before being dispatched to various foreign stations. In Orion's case, she joined the home fleet on January 18th of 1934, but she would only remain there until summer 1937, with the cruiser sent off to the West Indies station, arriving at Bermuda on September 3rd of 1937. None of this is particularly out of the ordinary, at least to this point. Her service while in Bermuda would mostly follow the pattern, with the exception of a couple incidents early on in her West Indies service. The first came on September 22nd, 1937, when she picked up a cadet from USS Annapolis. The man was suffering from issues with his appendix and needed a faster ship to bring him to port, which Orion did by the morning of the 23rd. Meanwhile, the second incident involved the body of the former Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. He died from a heart attack on an ocean liner on November 9th, 1937. His body was dropped off on Bermuda on the 15th, where Orion performed the memorial service. Other than those two events, however, it was a fairly quiet life in the sunny Caribbean. At least until late 1939, when the Second World War broke out. When this came at the start of September, Orion was still in the West Indies, and she would remain there hunting for blockade runners through the end of the year. With German blockade runners less of a concern by 1940, Orion would finally be sent back home. She departed Bermuda in February after a short refit in January 1940. In any case, Orion reached home by March, where she went in for another refit that lasted until March 14th, after which the cruiser was reassigned to the 7th Cruiser Squadron of the Mediterranean Fleet. As it would turn out, Orion spent the majority of her active combat service in that theater. The cruiser would arrive in Alexandria in May 1940, although she spent her early time on training, before her own combat duty began in the form of a shore bombardment, when Orion turned her guns on Bardia on June 21st, 1940, where she joined a squadron centered on the French battleship Lorraine in bombarding the Italian port. This was the first time Orion fired her guns in anger. Of course, it would be nowhere near the final time. Only a few days later, on June 27th, she would fight an engagement that I've covered a couple times on this channel, the sinking of the Italian destroyer Espero. Notable for two things: how much Espero embarrassed the Royal Navy and the sheer expenditure of ammunition needed to put her down. O'Hara cites 5,000 shells between the Royal Navy cruisers, with HMAS Sydney in particular shooting so much that she burnt the paint off her barrels. He goes further in saying the entire Mediterranean fleet was down to 800 6-inch shells after this action, all to sink one old destroyer. You can see why I've covered it before. Regardless, after this embarrassing situation, Orion continued on. Her next action came in the Battle of Calabria on July 9th, 1940, where she served well, although without notable damage, either to herself or to the Italians. The rest of 1940, for its part, would pass without notable incident, primarily escorting convoys or patrolling, with the odd shore bombardment. In fact, Orion got up to a few of those. As it would turn out, her next surface action only came on November 13th, where Orion helped sink 4 merchant ships, in addition to damaging the escort. After this, Orion returned to her escort duty, something she would remain on for the rest of 1940 through to early 1941. Although this isn't to say that duty was entirely uneventful. On January 11th, 1941, Orion was part of Operation Excess. This would see severe air attack by German and Italian forces, so severe that the cruiser HMS Southampton was crippled. Orion would pick up survivors before helping to scuttle the wrecked cruiser. Meanwhile, February and most of March 1941 would prove less eventful. The patrols and escort duty saw less in the way of actual combat, with this only returning at the end of March in the Battle of Cape Matapan on March 28, 1941. Orion's first part in this battle was encountering and subsequently escaping the Italian heavy cruisers. The goal for this stage of the battle being luring the Italians into the guns of the Mediterranean Fleet battleships. This wouldn't succeed, but the British at least avoided damage of their own. On the other hand, when the Italians broke off and the British shadowed them, Orion was in for excitement. As O'Hara put it, an officer on the cruiser's bridge, while eating a sandwich, made this comment: "What's that battleship over there? I thought ours were miles away." That battleship was Vittorio Veneto, and she opened fire on Orion, straddling the cruiser several times, never scoring any direct hits, but coming uncomfortably close all the same. Nonetheless, aside from splinter damage, Orion came out in one piece, with her direct role in the action mostly ending at this point, other than sighting the crippled cruiser Pola on radar later in the battle. When that battle came to an end with the destruction of the Italian cruisers, Orion returned to her convoy duty. This would last through April and most of May 1941, with the cruiser's next notable engagements coming at the end of that month. First, a night battle with the torpedo boat Lupo, where the Italian ship came within meters of crashing into Orion's stern. The British reported only 20mm fire actually landing, but it was a close thing. And unfortunately for Orion, her first major damage would come a few days later. On May 29, 1941, she was carrying around 1,000 soldiers during the evacuation of Crete. During this, the cruiser would be subjected to intense air attack. First, a near miss that dropped her speed to 21 knots. Then, a German bomber dove from the sky and kept going past the point of no return. His aircraft would crash into the sea, but his bomb landed on Orion. This blasted into the roof of A turret and blew the roof off with enough force to bend the barrels of B turret behind it. Even this wasn't the worst damage. Another bomber hit Orion in the bridge. However, the bomb penetrated before detonating in the 4-inch magazine next to the stoker's mess hall. In addition, Orion's steering was wrecked, a boiler room flooded, and the ship took on a severe list as she was steered from her stern steering. She would limp to Alexandria by the evening of May 29th, almost completely out of fuel and ammo, with between 85 to 111 of her crew lost, depending on the source, and a further 150 to 400 of the soldiers, with O'Hara citing 500 casualties among those men. Orion was so badly damaged that she was sent off to the United States for repair, arriving at Mare Island on September 5th, where she would remain until February of 1942. Admittedly, Orion was in good company. Warspite was undergoing repairs at Bremerton at the same time. Both ships arrived to an ostensibly neutral nation, and both would leave with a new ally after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Although for Orion, her work in dock wasn't done. she left the United States, arriving back in Britain in April 1942, where the ship was in for further refit work to update her radar and fire control equipment. This lasted until the end of the month, with Orion doing post-refit trials through May. More dock work came in June, with the ship only returning to proper service in July. This likely speaks to how damaged Orion really was, as the British spent time making sure the ship was in one piece. She was by the end of this, with Orion sent off to escort convoys and patrol out of Freetown and Cape Town. This would last from the end of July through the end of August 1942. Only at this point was Orion finally set to return to the Mediterranean. She sailed through the Red Sea, arriving back at Alexandria at the start of October, for what would, in the end, be far quieter duty. By this point of the war, the Italian fleet was largely confined to port. Not entirely, but the days of grand sea battles were mostly over for this theater. As such, Orion would spend the rest of 1942 and most of 1943 on one of three duties: patrol, convoy escort, and shore bombardment. In the latter case, supporting the invasions of Sicily and Italy proper, with Sicily coming on July 10th, 1943, and Italy, specifically Salerno, coming on September 11th. Through all of this, Orion avoided any further damage, and after a short refit in October 1943, she was right back to bombarding Italian targets to round out the year. Or rather, German targets in Italy by this point, with 1944 following much the same pattern. She supported the landings at Anzio on January 11th, with the cruiser continuing this role through to April 1944. This would be her last stint bombarding Italian targets. Orion was instead reassigned to the upcoming Normandy landings, which would see her bombard German positions on June 6, 1944, in support of the British and Canadian landing operations, something she continued through June 10th, to the point of needing to replace worn-out gun barrels. As if all of this wasn't enough landing support, Orion would also provide gunfire for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France on August 15, 1944, although this would be her last time firing ashore during 1944, as it would turn out. Orion rounded off the year escorting ships and supporting various landings in the Aegean. This was rather uneventful, with the cruiser ending the year in refit at Malta. This came to an end in February 1945, with Orion's last combat action coming in one last bombardment of San Remo in April 1945. With the war in Europe ending on May 8th, that would be the end of her combat duty. Orion wasn't assigned to the Pacific and would round out her service in the Mediterranean, with the cruiser ultimately decommissioned in July 1946. Her final duty would be underwater explosion experiments in June 1948, with HMS Orion scrapped in July 1949. She got around, to say the least, and those 13 battle honors were well earned. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.